Mr. Georgette Debroy, who will give opening remarks, but first I will go over some meeting reminders. To begin, this event is 1 hour and it is being recorded. Later, you will be able to access the recording on the Winrock International website. Next, the structure of our hour together is after we hear from Mr. Debroy, I will introduce our esteemed panelists who will each share how the annual State Department Trafficking in Persons Report, or TIP report, impacts foreign assistance and informs programmatic priorities. They may also speak to how the counter-trafficking community can support governments to address the report's recommendations. After we hear from the three speakers, we will begin the question and answer session. Please note that attendees are muted, so I encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. To close our event, Winrock International's Director of Counter-Trafficking and Safe Migration, Ms. Stephanie Lilligard, will give brief remarks. Now, it is my privilege to share a few details with you about Mr. Georgette Debroy. Mr. Debroy oversees all program units, including human rights, education and empowerment, agriculture, resilience and water, and environment and energy. Mr. Debroy has implemented projects for a variety of government clients, multilateral development banks, foundations, and the private sector, including with partners of the U.S. Agency for International Development, United States Department of Agriculture, United States Department of Labor, and the World Bank. And he has worked in more than 38 countries across Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Georgette, thank you again for joining us today and giving opening remarks. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Nicole. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining. And thank you again for joining this informative discussion today. My name, again, as Nicole said, Georgette Debroy, and I'm Winrock's Chief Global Programs Officer. In advance of World Day Against Trafficking in Persons on July 30th, we are pleased to welcome you to our webinar today, Research into Action, the U.S. Department of State's Trafficking in Persons Report, and U.S. Foreign Assistance Programming. Winrock International began our work to combat trafficking in persons in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union and has since expanded our global footprint. Today, we are implementing 13 counter-trafficking projects across 17 countries, many of which are in close partnership with the US government. Each year, around this date, the US Department of State releases its annual Trafficking in Persons report, which elevates nations' successes, shortfalls, and acts as a call to action to governments around the world to strengthen counter-trafficking response. The Trafficking in Persons report informs direct assistance to foreign governments, uplifts global champions and achievements, and is a practical tool to strengthen coordination and adherence to international standards. Today, we are pleased to welcome distinguished colleagues Miranda Jellicoe, USAID's team lead for Justice, Human Rights, and Security from the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Bureau, Mark Forstrom, U.S. Department of State Deputy Senior Coordinator for International Programs in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and Leila Stratkamp, U.S. Department of Labor Senior International Relations Officer at the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. Our guests will share their experiences on how the counter-trafficking community can support governments to address the report's recommendation. And obviously, this year's theme for World Day Against Trafficking in Persons is Reach Every Victim, Leave No One Behind. Globally, trafficking rates are not improving. COVID-19 has changed the characteristics of trafficking, pushing it further underground and making it harder to detect. Global crises, including conflict and climate change, are displacing already vulnerable communities and increasing economic disparities. Leaving no one behind is a commitment to end exploitation, supporting survivors from identification through reintegration, and reducing vulnerability of at-risk communities. We are happy to work in partnership with governments, including our colleagues here today, civil society, and businesses to reduce vulnerability and end trafficking in persons. Thank you again for joining Winrock International as we mark World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. And thank you to all of our panelists for the open discussion today. We hope today's conversation inspires us all to think about our role in combating trafficking in persons and ways we can work together as a global coalition of government, civil society, private sector, and most importantly, survivors to combat this crime. With this, I will turn the floor over to my colleague, Nicole Goodrich, again, Senior Technical Advisor for Counter Trafficking at Winrock, to get us started for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgette, for those opening remarks. I am going to turn to our panelists in the order that were in the invitation. But before I do that, I want to share a few highlights of their expertise. Miranda has over 20 years of experience working on democracy, governance, human rights, and rule of law. She has focused her USAID Foreign Service career on tackling complex global issues. She and her team oversee implementation of USAID's counter-trafficking in persons policy and provide global technical assistance to USAID missions around the world. Prior to coming back to Washington, she served as the director of the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Office at the USAID mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she led US efforts to re-engage the justice sector, as well as lead foreign assistance with the new Counter-Trafficking in Persons Agency. Miranda has also served in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Indonesia. And prior to joining USAID in 2011, she worked at the US Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice, International Division, focusing on international issues, including trafficking in persons. Miranda has also served as an attorney on several international human rights and US domestic immigration and civil cases. Mark Forstrom began his career at the State Department Tip Office 16 years ago. He has broad oversight of the office's foreign assistance funds, including the Program to End Modern Slavery and the Child Protection Compact partnerships. Mark also works closely with others to shape and develop the TIP office's overall funding strategy and strategic vision. This includes oversight of more than $75 million in foreign assistance for this year, 2023. And as of July of this year, the TIP office manages 90 bilateral and regional projects in approximately 90 countries worth more than $200 million. Prior to joining the TIP office in 2007, Mark worked as a congressional aide on Capitol Hill, and before that, he worked for several years as an attorney in private practice in the state of Washington. Layla Stroopkamp has 15 years of experience with the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or ILAB. Her portfolio focuses on project development, grant oversight, stakeholder engagement, and research on labor issues in foreign countries and global supply chains. Previously, her responsibilities at the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking included the Counter-Trafficking in Persons policy, trade policy negotiations, international labor standards monitoring, and training on research protocols for the Department of Labor's findings on the worst forms of child labor and lists of goods produced by child and forced labor. In addition, Layla has provided oversight for many of her office's commissioned studies on forced labor and child labor. So again, thank you to our panelists for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Miranda from USAID to kick us off. Please, Miranda.
Nicole, thank you so much. And I just want to say that I really appreciate you and Winrock putting on this panel and highlighting the trafficking report and really the important work that USAID State and the Department of Labor do. I think, again, partnership and the U.S. interagency and all of us working on this issue is really needed. So for USAID, we take a longer term approach to development, and we know many of the issues that cause trafficking in persons or exacerbate trafficking in persons where we are the target of a lot of our development assistance. I start there because how we ground our trafficking in persons approach is often within our larger development strategy within a country. So what we call our country development cooperation strategies, and then also our regional development strategies. And then here in Washington, we have the global CTIP policy that guides our work. And I start there because USAID's staff is primarily overseas in our missions. Many of our staff that are leading our CTIP efforts around the world are our local staff. We have a CTIP person point of contact in each of our missions. And USAID is quite decentralized. And so I think when we take that bigger picture of the development needs, what the root causes are, USAID has a number of programs that look at TIP on its own, but I think we've also been really trying to push an integration approach to counter trafficking in persons. We consider the TIP report recommendations that come from state as very important. I think they give us a launching point, particularly for USAID and state and the embassy, to when we're in country to be able to have conversations with the government about how serious the US is taking this. I think that very much helps us within our development mission point on some of those things that need to be done within trafficking, but also those bigger root causes, whether that's economic livelihoods. And many places we see corruption exacerbating trafficking in persons. So I think for us, we're trying to look at the wider country situation, consider interventions overall that have a significant and lasting impact on addressing and preventing TIP. And when we design those interventions, we're really trying to make sure that those are aligned to our USAID and government wider development strategies, and making sure that TIP is then a part of the host country government strategy. So I want to go back a little bit more to, USAID again operates a little bit differently. We don't have special standalone CTIP funding. We wish we did, like our JTIP colleagues, but I think one of the things that we're really trying to do more of is how do we integrate CTIP approaches into our health programming, into our agriculture programming, into labor for both prevention and response when we are unable to have a standalone trafficking in persons activity. So an example of that is at USAID Ghana. We have the Ghana Fisheries Recovery Act that's implemented by Tetra Tech. So there are about 2.7 child laborers in Ghana, many of whom work in the fisheries because that is economic livelihood. In Ghana, it's quite important to the culture there. We not only look to the State Department TIP report, but we've conducted a number of vulnerability assessments to understand the scope, the drivers of labor trafficking vulnerabilities in fisheries, community-driven actions, and ways to influence policy, including the integration of counter-trafficking measures in fisheries management and our livelihoods work and our gender-based violence work, and also within our USAID-funded reproductive health activities. That allows us to get at socioeconomic drivers of child labor and trafficking, and look at improved prevention, detection, social welfare, and livelihoods for vulnerable communities. We've seen success there in being able to work with community leaders to make proclamations against child labor and trafficking. We've been able to reach about 2,500 people there and indirectly about 20,000 people to really understand counter-trafficking in persons and establishing formal reporting mechanisms by the Fisheries Commission. So I give that example as how we're able to integrate approaches. I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we did work with the Presidential Trafficking Commission. The TIP report obviously was quite important there because DRC was tier 3 ranking from USAID. One of the things we initially had a program to respond, I think, directly to many pieces of the report. And I would say that we had to really continually to review that to see what was sustainable in Congo, where there were priorities and where they could actually, in fact, respond to that. And we did continue to work with the commission, but we had to start integrating TIP into things like our GBV programs to reach more people. We actually, in fact, decided that a rule of law program was really necessary, because even though there was a TIP law that was about to be come out, and that was great, and that was a recommendation, there was really no judiciary to be able to enforce those laws. And so we saw kind of this longer term development issues where we really had to take a bigger approach to that to realize how we would get at TIP in a sustainable way. And then just, I know probably over time, but I do want to say one of the things that we've really tried to do at AID is commit to survivor-centered and trauma-informed approaches. It is one of the principles, and we've tried to get at a very holistic approach to our programming. So looking at psychosocial welfare in addition to other types of rights that are included within our TIP approach. So I'll stop there because I know that we have limited time, and hopefully we'll get into more of this in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. Appreciated you raising points regarding sort of larger development goals that USAID is operating in. And I'm sure people will have questions to follow up from the points you made. And thank you for sharing examples from Ghana and the DRC on the integration too with rule of law, health, agriculture, economic growth activities. And I know we'll get to your last point that was raised on survivors and trauma-informed practices. So now, please, over to Mark Forstrom, Department of State, JTIP Office.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Miranda. Yes, as Georgette said, my name is Mark Forstrom, and I am the Deputy Senior Coordinator in the Trafficking Person Office's International Programs team. And I am pleased to be joined by colleagues from both USAID and the Department of Labor, key partners of my office in everything we do. So appreciate also Winrock putting this together to celebrate World Day Against Trafficking. And I want to also thank Winrock for being such a great partner, not just to my office, but throughout the world in combating human trafficking, where they are doing one of our more cutting edge trafficking projects in Bangladesh, which looks at the intersection of climate change on human trafficking. So thank you. If my office is known for anything, it's probably the annual report, which I'm sure many or most of you know about. It is the U.S. government's primary diplomatic and diagnostic tool used to guide relations with our foreign governments on human trafficking. It evaluates or assesses the efforts of 188 governments this year. The report came out in June, and the governments that it assesses includes the United States. It looks at the minimum standards set forth in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and it includes assessments of every government and what the government is doing. And I think that's super important. In reading the report, it really does assess what governments are doing. For those of you who are looking to the report to determine maybe where priorities might be, at least for the U.S. government and my office when it comes to any particular country, the country-specific recommendations are in rank order. They're not numbered, but they really are in sort of rank order. So that might be of assistance. My team uses the report in a variety of ways. First, and particularly for my colleagues who handle regional portfolios, they turn to the recommendations, the country recommendations, when they're prioritizing where to put our funding and what aspects of trafficking to maybe address. They'll analyze current funding that might be coming to a close or closely coming to an end. They'll closely examine countries' gaps, current gaps and needs, and weigh where our funding might be able to make the most impact. I will say, of course, the report is not the only source. There are many projects where, a key feature is, government partnership, government will, and we assess that as well. If you're looking at our funding over the last few years, you'll see a couple of themes with our funding that have been highlighted in the report. A focus of the report, a focus for all of us in the world over the last several years, has been the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on what traffickers have been able to do. While we knew at the time, in hindsight, we can really see how the COVID pandemic presented an opportunity, sadly, for traffickers to exploit the most vulnerable. Of course, the pandemic, as I say, was a primary focus of the report. We on the international programs team published two specific special funding opportunities that were focused on COVID and its impact on human trafficking. Under those funding opportunities, we invested about $4.5 million, finalizing 14 awards. Drilling down a little bit on the pandemic, one of the features of trafficking that it really exploded over this time has been the commercial online child sexual exploitation, which amounting to child sex trafficking, or the often used acronym is OSEC. In response, my office is currently investing in projects all over the world that include aspects of addressing OSEC. They have been particular features of some of our child protection compact partnerships that Nicole mentioned at the outset. These are negotiated agreements with partner governments to work on aspects of child trafficking that are particularly endemic to that country. The most recently signed and executed partnership is with the government of Colombia. And one of the features of that, or one of the aspects of it, is to address what in Colombia they refer to as online webcam modeling, which is really sex trafficking. I will say we in my office had a large investment also in the Philippines on this subject of addressing OSEC. It was a primary feature of the Philippines Child Protection Partnership. If you look at this year's, the 2023 TIP report, One of the features or the facets is an emerging crime, which is cyber scam operations. The report this year analyzes this emerging trend, and there's a dedicated special interest box on the nexus of human trafficking and forced labor in cyber operations. Traffickers have yet again leveraged the pandemic and pandemic-related economic hardships, increased global youth unemployment, and international travel restrictions to exploit thousands and thousands of adults and children in a multi-billion-dollar industry over the last 2 years. Often these individuals are forced to participate in cyber scams under impossible quota arrangements that make them increasingly indebted to their traffickers. And traffickers use this debt to exploit the victims in forced labor and sex trafficking, including in special economic zones throughout Southeast Asia. This year's report identifies the location of reported cyber scam operations in 5 countries in Southeast Asia: Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And it notes that there have been victims identified from 35 countries spread throughout the world, everywhere from Angola to Turkey to the United States. This year's, we have on the international programs team our notice of funding opportunity, which is on the street now. It closes on Monday, but if you want to take a look, please go to either grants.gov or samsdomestic.gov to find the funding opportunity. In the funding opportunity, we have highlighted this forced criminality. The Southeast Asia priorities in the funding opportunity are all aimed at addressing this exploding crime. There are 4 priorities, as I say. Each of them in Southeast Asia looks at this crime, which, as I say, was a feature of this year's report. With that, I think I'm probably at about time. Let me turn it back over to Nicole. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for detailing that 188 countries had been included in this year's TIP report and making the point that it is an assessment of those governments' actions to address trafficking in persons. And also, I am sure there'll be questions regarding the impacts of COVID-19 that you mentioned from OSEC, online child sexual exploitation, and then the new focus with addressing cyber crimes and the examples you provided. Thank you. Now going to turn to Layla Schotkamp with Department of Labor iLab for her remarks. Layla, please.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you to Winrock for the opportunity to participate in the discussion today. I'm really honored to join my fellow panelists for the discussion. I will share a little bit about our Bureau's work and the Trafficking in Persons portfolio, and as it relates to what we learned from the Trafficking in Persons report and work with our colleagues in that office. The Bureau of International Labor Affairs safeguards dignity at work by helping to ensure that other countries meet international standards. Within that, for more than 25 years, our Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking has been a world leader in the fight to eradicate these forms of exploitation across the globe, with a focus on the most vulnerable populations and communities. Within our office, our Technical Assistance and Cooperation Unit currently manages an active portfolio of approximately 50 projects to combat child labor and forced labor around the world. And these projects aim to make a difference in the lives of children and their families, including through research, education, livelihood support, awareness raising, and increasing the capacity of governments and other stakeholders to combat child and forced labor. We fund projects to work with various stakeholders, not only governments, also private sector and civil society organizations, to strengthen laws, improve enforcement, develop and refine policies, and implement social programs in support of our goal of ending these exploitative practices. In terms of trafficking in persons, aside from our programming that addresses these issues, we also have an active role as a part of the cabinet level presidential interagency task force on trafficking in persons. Our office provides and our bureau provides support to our department leadership to participate in that coordination. And we also serve on several committees of the Senior Policy Operating Group that supports the task force in ongoing interagency coordination. Looking at how the Bureau uses the Trafficking in Persons report and how considerations from what is in that report are reflected in our work and our programming, we also seek to put research into action by applying and find the findings and the recommendations of U.S. government reporting and other credible sources to our program design and implementation. As mandated by legislation and presidential directives, our own Research and Policy Division produces an annual report on the worst forms of child labor, which you mentioned, Nicole. And this report focuses on countries that are beneficiaries of trade preference programs, and specifically on government actions in 5 major areas of effort to eliminate the worst forms of child labor. And we also maintain, as you mentioned, lists of products by good and country of origin that we have reason to believe are produced with child labor, forced labor, or forced child labor in violation of international standards. A newer area of our work, driven by congressional mandate through the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, includes supply chain research to identify goods made with inputs made with child labor or forced labor. In this work, the Trafficking in Persons report is a very important source of information for all of our research products. And in addition, we observe and recognize that the Trafficking in Persons report can influence the implementing context for labor rights programming in cases where stakeholders are responsive to its assessments and demonstrate motivation to address gaps in their counter-trafficking approach. One reason for that is we see that, as Miranda was discussing how trafficking is situated in a larger context, some of the root causes that lead to trafficking in persons also frequently indicate a lack of an enabling environment for fundamental labor rights, such as freedom of association and collective bargaining, as well as more severe forms of exploitation, forced labor. So observing sort of the motivation of stakeholders in response to this report can help us assess whether the ground is fertile for labor programming. I also want to say, Mark, we very much value our coordination with you, your team, on programming in the area of labor trafficking as one of the worst forms of child labor and forced labor, and that we advise and exchange information on the child protection compacts that Mark mentioned that are signed with country governments for technical assistance to address child trafficking. And the purpose of our coordination is to ensure that our respective programming initiatives in those countries are as complementary and comprehensive as possible to address the issues. So lastly, I'd like to emphasize one of the principles that is very important to our work, which is the importance of centering worker voice and partnerships with representative organizations. As the 2023 TIP report emphasizes, it is critical to listen to the voices of those who have survived exploitation, to understand and incorporate their perspectives when designing and implementing programming. And our Bureau's work aims to lift up workers' voices, particularly those most vulnerable to labor abuse, and put them front and center. For example, our Global Forced Labor Project, which is called A Bridge to Action on Forced Labor, supported the reintegration of hundreds of formerly bonded laborers in Nepal, whose circumstances were driven by caste-based discrimination and social exclusion, into their local labor markets and business communities through programs that provided vocational training and livelihood support. The project helped these survivors to collectively identify and advocate for their rights, which resulted in significant policy changes and commitments from their national and local governments to provide appropriate restitution. And moreover, the project partnered with organizations who represent these vulnerable communities to identify participants for project services and to facilitate delivery of those services. And this approach generated many positive results, including improved confidence and self-esteem for participants, particularly women. It also evidenced decreased youth labor migration to other countries for employment, which is another vector of trafficking risk for these vulnerable communities. So I just wanted to share that as one of the examples of how we are applying the principle of listening to survivors, working with them to understand their needs and enable them to participate in the design and implementation of our programming. And with that, I'll turn it back to Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. I appreciate the points that you had raised for everyone's awareness of 50 projects globally to address child labor and forced labor, and how you are integrating in your office the TIP report's recommendations and making this last point on workers' rights and making sure workers' rights and workers themselves and their voice are up front. Thank you for sharing that example with bonded laborers and the results that you have achieved. And I know everyone attending has appreciated hearing from all three of you about how the annual TIP report is utilized in your priorities, decisions, and moving forward with assistance in programming. So we have a few minutes left still for question and answer. I do see a couple questions in the chat function. I want to remind attendees that you are on mute, but please feel free to write your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little Q&A. And to allow people to add a couple more questions in there, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and kick it off with a question, really more of a request to all of you to this last point, Layla, you were raising. And I'd like to start with you if you want to add to it, and then we'll go in reverse order with Mark and Miranda, but about the critical importance of working with survivors and persons with lived experience to elevate their voices, absolutely, to make our projects centered, but also to make sure their engagement and their inclusion is meaningful and it's just, and it's of course not doing further harm and re-victimizing or re-traumatizing any of those persons. So if you could expound on your last point, and you're welcome to share other examples of how survivor engagement is done in a thoughtful, inclusive, just, do no harm way for Department of Labor. That would be great. Over to you, and then Mark and Miranda, and then I will go to questions in the chat.
Thank you, Nicole. Yes. Just to pull back a bit from the example to more broadly, I just would like to say that we support and emphasize programming that is sensitive to factors that increase the vulnerabilities to labor and trafficking exploitation for underserved populations and that create barriers to accessing remedies. And our funding opportunities often reflect this priority and the necessity of considering those factors in program design. For example, whether there is a need to provide material in a format that's accessible by workers who are not literate, or removing barriers to participation in particular trainings due to competing obligations such as caregiving for young dependents. A specific example I can share on sort of the trauma-informed response to trafficking issues is a project which counters online sexual exploitation of children in Southeast Asia, and its work seeks to improve protocols for survivor services and to avoid practices that may re-traumatize. And the approach includes adapting and improving child protection systems to better serve the needs of children who are exploited in this manner and who may be particularly vulnerable, for example, to psychosocial trauma from their experiences. So that's one case where the importance of being sensitive to those dynamics is particularly relevant and a very important emphasis of the programming. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Mark, would you like to answer? And then Miranda?
Sure, Nicole. Yes, over, I would say, probably the last 6, 7, 8 years, our office's not just awareness of, we've been aware for a long time, but acting on sort of survivor engagement and you know, consciously seeking out the insights and analysis of folks with lived experiences has really grown greatly. There's the U.S. Advisory Council that consists of 11 survivors who bring their expertise and experience to advise and make recommendations to the President's Interagency Task Force to improve anti-trafficking policies. They produce an annual report, which is really addressed at the U.S. government. In addition, my office has a contract with a consultant group that works with survivors, so that we're able to not just call upon those with lived experiences for their expertise, but compensate them for their time and what they bring to us. My office and the U.S. government was joined by a survivor at an international forum last year, where the survivor actually provided the statement for the United States at the event. More granularly, just in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks, there was a training that was conducted in Colombia for what are called duplas in the country, and it included presentations by survivors to these officials. When it comes to trauma-informed practices, victim-centered, and the like, it is really putting at the center the victim and what she or he is desires. It's really all about that. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Miranda?
Sure. So I think very much to add to what Mark and Layla have already said, one of USAID's 5 programmatic objectives in our revised counter-trafficking in persons policies, improved opportunities for survivor engagement within our programming. So we seek to incorporate survivor input into our policies and tools and guidance that USAID Washington releases, and looking into ways to include survivor input into project design to make sure that, and including during project implementation for those feedback loops, and to really make sure that survivor institutions are the partners that we're engaging with, and that they're working not just on like the activity and implementing, but really there from the start in terms of how we look at the design, making sure we're meaningfully engaging. So at the Washington level, we have coordinated with Mark's office at the State Department to be able to tap in to their human trafficking expert consultant network that has survivor consultants, as he's mentioned, to be able to review some of our key guidance coming out of Washington. And importantly, that network, as Mark had mentioned, compensate survivors for their time. That's quite important. At the project design process in country where USAID is working with our missions to design programs, we're working with a variety of CTIP stakeholders to make sure that we're working with those that make up the ecosystem and the landscape of where we need to engage, and that includes survivor alliance groups, if and when they exist in countries. I think, again, when USAID does conduct some of its assessments, the landscape in the country, to what survivors you can engage, whether they're, able to be out there, I think whether we're able to find ways to support them. And so we've worked with shelters, social workers, victims advocates, in addition to survivors. And I think this is something that USAID certainly within the next few years, we're really looking at ways where we can do more on survivor engagement and really key into trauma-informed approaches. I think we've seen that in examples of programming we have in Guatemala and Trinidad and Tobago, bringing in trauma-informed approaches, holistic services, making sure that we're working with a wide variety and including survivors in that project design and within the implementation. But I think we recognize that there's still, still more that we can do to support survivor advocacy groups, and are continuing to engage on different ideas and ways to do that.
Thank you, Miranda. I'm going to turn to questions in the Q&A function. So thank you to our attendees who have added them already. We'll see how many we can get through. I'm going to open this up to the panel. So panelists, you're welcome just to take yourself off mute. The first question is getting to some of the underlying root causes that make people at risk to trafficking, including poverty. I've heard you discuss this, all of you, a little bit, but if you could share a little bit more information and how the US government may work with other organizations, other stakeholders that are concerned with addressing those underlying root causes that can create at-risk situations and vulnerabilities for people to be trafficked. So again, how would the US and how is the US working with other organizations to address some of those underlying root causes that can increase vulnerabilities or the at-risk of people to trafficking? I'll let you just take yourselves off mute. Miranda, go for it.
So I'm happy to start. I think, that's a quite broad question, because I think for us, it really depends on the particular context. So I gave the example of Ghana and fisheries. In other countries where we work on agriculture, where we know there are risks to agriculture communities and forced labor. and other countries that may be, you know, working with mining communities and mining police to review where there are human rights abuses and potential trafficking. So I think part of that for us certainly depends on what is happening within the trafficking environment, where we're seeing trafficking. And then certainly for, as I mentioned, in integration, I mean, how are we working with health providers? How are we working with other service delivery, including the justice sector, when they encounter? And again, for us, that country dynamic is going to be very different. People may not feel safe to interact with police in one country, and so the response network is going to look a lot different. So that's not a clear answer, because the question, you know, it depends.
The only thing I would add, and I think Miranda and USAID, probably with the incorporation of, or the inclusion of anti-trafficking work within their other broader programs in so many countries, is probably the place or the agency, at least on my end, that does this the most. But it's also, there's also the diplomatic angle that we have, whether it's our folks at the embassies who help carry the message for us, our colleagues, as Miranda mentioned, USAID has, again, folks all over the world, and is also able to carry this message. And then my colleagues, whether it be the folks from my team, but more particularly the folks from our reports team, my colleagues who actually write the country narratives and the assessments for the countries when they are on travel and visiting the countries. The message is it has to be broader. We all recognize the issue of root causes and the like that need to be addressed. So thank you.
And I'll just add that for the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, we really see the value in finding new partners. So looking beyond the traditional organizations and agencies that perhaps have been the go-to in the past, to look at where else is it possible to influence, to increase understanding and improve the systems and the services that are available to help prevent and redress these types of violations. So for example, our bridge project that I mentioned earlier worked in Niger, facilitating the receipt of identity cards and birth certificates for vulnerable children and adults. And just getting at sort of the root cause that children without birth certificates are more vulnerable to violence, abuse, and exploitation. Another example from that same project is that in Peru, the partner worked with the national agency that is responsible for land transport, covering people, cargo, and merchandise. And they raised awareness among all the actors in that agency and in that industry, from drivers to agency managers and even the passengers, to recognize signs of forced labor and trafficking. And it also supported training for agency inspectors that had really strong results in terms of those who were trained identified an average of 10 cases for investigation using what they had learned from that training on indicators of forced labor and related crimes. So again, I think that there are a lot of opportunities within government agencies at all levels, and also within communities. And I think that an area of organizations that can be, that has a lot to offer in terms of forced labor and labor trafficking potentially, is in the area of worker organizations, whether that be trade unions or less formal groups of that can express collective worker perspective and voice, can help report, can help identify gaps in services and systems that are there as a potential partner for this type of programming. Thank you.
Thank you all for addressing that question. I know we're coming up on time, and we do have some closing remarks, and so I want to be aware of that for everyone. I also noticed a few questions in the chat relate to this topic of encouraging host governments to raise their rankings in the TIP report by addressing those recommendations. So that's first part of the question. How are you all working with the government to continue to motivate and encourage them to address trafficking in persons? And second, the second part of a question is, related question, excuse me, is, are you also seeing government response in those countries to match funding levels or to engage without US assistance necessarily to address the root causes, to work on prevention, protection, prosecution, and form those partnerships? So a two-part question related to host governments' actions in addressing trafficking. Over to our panelists. Take yourself off mute, please.
I'll take, thanks, Nicole. I'll take certainly the first part of that. And the way that, as I mentioned, that we go about it is really, it is with the report, it is our primary diplomatic tool. And so when my colleagues meet with, when we meet with government representatives in every meeting, of course, the a feature of it, and an important feature, is to highlight the recommendations again that are in rank order, that from our assessment are the steps that are really needed. When it comes to the second part of the question about government investments and the like that might replace what we're doing, obviously that is our goal. That is our ultimate goal. Everything we do has with a lens in it, the sustainability that needs to happen. It can't just be us. We recognize that. It can't just be my office or Miranda's or Layla's doing this, that it really has to be a priority of the government. I'm not going to lie, it's difficult. It is a battle, and in many places, frankly, where we're working, there often are not. The resources are very, very, very thin, and of course, governments have many priorities and many things that they must respond to and act upon. That said, as I say, it is a feature of everything we do, how to sort of hand over what we're doing to our government partners in the foreign realm. Over.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I don't see Miranda or Layla coming off mute, so we'll try for one more question. Again, there are some specific questions too. I just want to say to attendees for different panelists, and I can copy and paste those to you and we'll get responses back. But one last point is really thinking about how this work may impact survivors or persons with lived experience that are in another country from their from where they've been received. Is there anything that you all would like to speak to in terms of that? So working again with survivors, persons with lived experience that may be in another country rather than their origin country, and how programming may assist them. Miranda, go for it. Okay, Mark and then Miranda.
If I'm understanding correctly, these are individuals who are not in their home country. They were either trafficked to a third country or somehow ended up there. When it comes to those individuals being involved in our programming, I mean, certainly in the area of protection, all of the protection work that we do in the way of whether it be shelter, psychosocial, medical, legal assistance. All of that is on our side, is addressed at trafficking victims, including those who might be victims in a country where we're working, but who are not citizens or not residents of that country. If the country's systems allow for the individuals to stay, maybe there's a special visa program or something. There are more opportunities now than there were 2 years ago, and I believe there'll be more opportunities 2 years from now than exist today, where survivors and those with lived experiences can be part of programming, and a lot of that comes from being maybe part of a civil society organization that's working on the issue in that country, a civil society organization that maybe my office or Layla's or Miranda's might have an opportunity to fund, whether it be directly or indirectly through sub-grants. Over.
Thanks, Mark. Miranda, maybe 1 minute, and then we will have Stephanie Lilligard close us out.
Sure. I mean, I think Mark said, much of what we would say at USAID. I mean, we certainly work with governments to make sure that there's immigration relief to foreign victims. Often we are working with survivors, whether that's at shelters, regardless of their status. And then on things like voluntary repatriation. But often during that process, when we and our partners are engaging them, I mean, that very much is fed into how we've engaged government on their process of how they're working with survivors from other countries who are within that country, and making sure that those lived experiences are actually, influencing that feedback loop and how we're trying to advocate for reforms. And so their voice is very important. And some, may not want to go back home or are looking for different services. And so I think we've often made sure that feedback loop is there and continues to be important.
Thank you all for addressing the questions, and thanks to those who put questions in. I apologize if we didn't have time for yours. Hopefully we'll have future events and we can get back to those points that have been raised. But right now, over to Stephanie Lilligard, Director of Counter Trafficking and Safe Migration at Winrock, for closing remarks.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to our distinguished panelists and everyone who joined us today. In advance of World Day Against Trafficking in Persons next week, we recognize that it is our collective responsibility to uphold human dignity and, as Layla and Miranda and Mark have highlighted, uplift the voices of workers and survivors to understand and integrate their perspectives and put them front and center. The U.S. Department of State Trafficking in Persons report is an important call to action to this point. Leaving no victim behind is a commitment to ending exploitation, supporting survivors, and reducing vulnerability. A global problem like trafficking in persons needs a global solution. We are pleased to partner with the government, civil society, businesses, and survivors, including everyone here today, to combat trafficking in persons and ensure that no victim is left behind. Thank you all for your collaboration on this critical issue, and thank you again for everyone for joining us here today. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.